Hey guys, it's Drew again. As I was looking through my room the other day, just kind of stepping back and seeing some of the things I've got, there was something that I noticed that really defined why my channel is a vintage legacy. So let's check it out. So as you guys know, my channel full name is The Drew, a Vintage Legacy. And I take that vintage legacy kind of important because vintage being, the age and how old stuff is, and we kind of categorize cards and memorabilia, autographs or whatever into a vintage category. And I really love that. I love the history of baseball. It's so deep and rich. It's just interwoven within the culture of America, really back from its inception in the mid-1800s through the Civil War, all the way through until modern times. And there's just such a great culture of it, and I love that part of it. And a legacy being that it's more than a story. It's a collection of stories that create something. Well, as I was going through my room the other day, I like to sit back and I look at all these collections that I've put together. They all sort of tell a story. As you may have noticed, I've changed the background up here. I've got this great group of magazines, and I thought, you know what, I want to sort of display them. So I made these quick little shelves, and just to kind of switch up what I've got, where they are, and just to kind of show off different parts of my collection, and just want to do that a little bit more. But anyway, so in my baseball room, this is actually a bedroom, an old bedroom, and what I had done was to get more wall space was in the closet. I had taken the closet doors off, and I actually used that as an inset where I have Griffey stuff and some other things, not the vintage side, but sort of where I started with my Griffey stuff and collecting. And there's a small rack in there that holds something, and I'll show that right now. And I want to explain why this is important, why this rack, because when you look at it, it's just a few different things put together on a little shelf. But I want to talk about the history of how this came to be, and why this is the perfect example of a vintage legacy. So first, we're going to talk about the shelf. So I have the shelf here. And the shelf itself is not very complicated. It's pretty simple. But the reason this is important is this is actually the very first shelf I ever made. I was in 7th grade, and it was a woodshop project that we made. And it was just a display shelf, and we followed a pattern. We used a little dado inset and glued it all together. We pegged it. If anybody is woodworkers, you understand what that stuff means. And then we had a choice to add a slot or not. And I added a slot, and you can see there's a slot on both shelves. And the reason I added this was because at that point in my life, I was very, very close to my grandfather, my father's father. And he was retired at that time, lived in North Carolina. He had retired down in North Carolina from New York. And he had a little woodworking business. And this, to me, was, I wanted to show my grandfather that there was a connection that I had of something that he could make. And one of the things is my grandmother collected plates, like decorative plates or whatever. And I thought, if I give this to my grandfather, then he could use these little slots to display plates. And, I didn't really think the fact that it's not very large for plates, you could maybe put 2. But I remember giving it to him, and he was so pleased with it, and that just made my day. And so he had this hanging up in his living room wall, and sure enough, he had plates on it. And I remember coming to visit him, and one of the cool things, and this kind of shows the frugality of my family and my grandfather, was I didn't think about it when I made it, but I didn't have any way to hang it. So what he did was he took, as you can see, some old soda can lids and tacked them on. And that's what he used to display that. And so that's an added touch from my grandfather, is this thing. And this hung in his wall, and unfortunately he passed away at my junior year in high school, and that devastated me. But I was very close to my grandmother. When I came to college in Georgia, it was only 2 hours from her, so I would go visit her. And at one point she gave this back, and she said, "I know you made this for Grandpa, but I want you to have it back." So I've always had this in a room. This was the very first shelf that I ever made, and this was my grandfather's shelf. And I want to talk about the items that are on there and why this is a legacy sort of thing. So the next thing I want to talk about is the Sports Illustrated. So the Sports Illustrated, I've got it here, and you saw it in the picture. It's from 1990, and it's Ken Griffey Jr., and it's the natural. And when I think I was in middle school or whatever, one of the Christmas gifts my parents started giving me was a Sports Illustrated subscription, and I got it every single year. And but when I went to college, of course, it kept coming to my home address, and they would hold them for me. And then when I would come home to visit or whatever, I would go through them and try to catch up. But it was kind of getting old because they were weekly. But my dad knew that I was a big Ken Griffey Jr. fan. So when this specific magazine came, they actually had a care package sent to me in college, and he added this. So this was the one that came to my house. So it's got the little thing, and you can actually see my name and my address from when I was a little kid, where I grew up in New Jersey. And so that I kept this magazine. And when my parents moved, my dad's company transferred him. They actually threw away all of my Sports Illustrateds. This is the only Sports Illustrated I have from my subscription growing up. Even though I have memories of hours of flipping through and reading them. But this is important. It was important to me not because it's the only one I have. This is the one that my dad thought enough to send to me in a care package because he knew that I liked Griffey. And the fact that it's got my address label on it, and the fact that I put it on a shelf that I gave to my grandfather, and that's just kind of cool to me. A few years later, there was a set that was put out talking about great cards. They made cards out of great Sports Illustrated covers, and I got this one, and that's why that one is displayed up there with it. And so that's just a really kind of neat thing. But the last thing I want to talk about, and to me this is kind of the connection for all of it. So you've got my grandfather, and then you have my father and myself. But I want to talk about this box of honey frosted Wheaties with Ken Griffey on the cover. It's gold embossed. It's got all this cool, not that one. It's got all these, dates or whatever. This box came out, I believe, in 1996. So this is in the height of his superstardom, with being in Seattle. They had just made the playoffs the previous year. You know the history. It's got talks about the sweet taste of the cereal and the sweet swing of Griffey, and it's just a neat piece. Well, my sister was actually in a grocery store, and she saw this, and she's like, "Oh, Drew might like this," so she bought it and she gave it to me, and it's perfect, and it actually fits perfect on the shelf. As you saw, and but here's what was cool was after a while of looking at this thing, and it's actually still has the original cereal in there. I kind of really want to know how does it taste or look or whatever, but I really don't know if I want to open it. But I want to talk about something specifically on this. And most foods, as you know, they'll have an expiration date or what they call a best if used by date. And it doesn't mean it's expired and bad for you. It just doesn't have the same quality. And on this, there's a date. And I want to show it to you close. It says better if used by. And you can see May 8th, 1997. And that's when this would have been pulled off the shelves, or supposedly pulled off the shelves because it was no longer good. Well, way back then, I had spent some time working in a grocery store, and I knew some different things. And one of the things I knew was that cereal had a 1 year from the time it was created, 1 year expiration date of how long it could sit on a shelf. So that means that if this expiration or best if used by date was May 8th, 1997, what that means is that this box was made and filled on May 8th, 1996, and that happens to be the birth date of my son. So I kind of like to say that this was introduced to the world the same day that my son was introduced to the world. And it's kind of a weird little thing, and maybe it's a little quirky. There's really no value to any of this, but the fact that there's a shelf that I had made for my grandfather, and a magazine that my dad had thought enough to send to me and put it all together and create it with a box of cereal that's nothing more than a quirky item. But the fact is it was made the same day that my son was born. It's just kind of a cool little legacy piece. And that, to me, is why display is important, because any display can tell a story as long as you can pull the parts and the components together. So that's my story. I hope you enjoy it, and if not, it's okay. This is more for just to put it down so my kids and my grandkids someday may be able to see this. But when you guys see this old shelf and where it came from, well, I made this back in 1983 when I was in 7th grade. My grandfather put the tabs on it to make it hang on the wall, and the magazine, the cereal, the whole thing, and it just creates a different story. So I appreciate you listening. I appreciate your time. And until next time, you guys be good.